Hello everyone, my name is Dula Osman. My planet study extensively cites the work of Asasa Jalata, who is a professor of sociology and global and Africana studies at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. His article, The Struggle for Knowledge, the Case of the Emergent Oromo Study, describes in similar way as in Tuck's article on damage and research specifically on the Oromo indigenous people who were colonized by the Ethiopian Empire, leading them to be erased within traditional Ethiopian history. The creation of Oromo studies through a desired-based framework is an attempt to replace the colonial history with a history of liberation and to refute the historical myths that have been produced to justify Ethiopian colonialism. The Oromo are the largest ethnic group in all of East Africa and within the country of Ethiopia, with a population of over 30 million people. Although they have no political power within the country of Ethiopia, as they were colonized by the Assyrian Empire with the help of European colonial power during the last decade of the 19th century as Africa was being partitioned. Ethiopian knowledge elites have continued to treat the Oromo as historical objects or have ignored them because of their subordination or powerlessness. The official history of Ethiopia has completely denied the Oromo from any historical space and replaced their official name with Gala, a derogatory name, which is connotated in the same manner as savage, slave, barbaric, inferior, and culture, ignorant. Jalata draws upon the participatory research methods of Orlando Fayez Borda and Mohammed Ansor in order to argue the domination of the masses by elites is rooted not only in the polarization of control over material production, but also over the means of knowledge production, including the control over social power to determine what is useful knowledge. For example, a Habasha scholar named Abba Bahare in the 16th century rationalized that he wrote the history of this bad people to express their readiness to kill people and their brutality of manners. Bethesda Tesla, in his book The Travels of the Jesuit in Ethiopia 1710, saw the Romans as the scourge that had made use against the Abyssinians. Similarly, James Bruce, in his book Travels and Adventures in the Abyssinian Nubibia 1768-1773, to discover the source of the Nile, saw the Oromo as the most cruel and destructive people who contributed to weakening and reducing the Abyssinian Empire than all other civil wars and all other foreign enemies put together. Generally speaking, the Oromo were depicted as enemies of the Emir, especially how the previous views about the Oromos affected some contemporary scholars. Taha Tesana argues that some old written records on the Oromo reflect some elements of racist ideology and have a tremendous influence on some of the scholars of modern Ethiopian history who have, for one reason or another, not been able to detach themselves from the archaic, wrong views about the Oromo. Jalata highlights the ideology of cultural universalism, which enables the dominant groups in the modern world economy to look at the world mainly from their own cultural perspectives and to control the economic and cultural resources of the dominated people. In order to understand how historical and social relations within the region, Jalata calls upon Ethiopianist and Africanist scholars to adopt a pluralistic lens that allows them to translate knowledge among very different and power differentiated communities. Reflecting on the major problems that face the Oromo studies today, Jalata asserts to write about the Oromo people is an uphill struggle because the Oromo history, culture, and civilization have been victimized by Ethiopian colonialism for more than a century. Until recently, the world did not even recognize the existence of Oromia and its people. Because of the lack of political power, the history of the largest ethnic nation in the Horn of Africa was not known. My own desired-based research is centered around giving the Oromo nation an opportunity to speak about land sovereignty and city master planning as they continue to be displaced by the Ethiopian Empire on their ancestral lands.
I'm Saeed, and in my plan of study, I'm working on a relationship with nature and non-human animals, and why it's important for us to stop exploitation, abuse, and cruelty to animals, and why we need to move from an anthropocentric perception of life on Earth to an ecocentric perception of life, and how speciesism is a social problem in the same way that sexism and racism and other forms of interspecies exploitation are considered social problems. Human liberation is not completed as long as other forms of oppression and domination against non-human animals and nature still exist. I would like to start with a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer in her wonderfully crafted book, Braiding Sweetgrass. She talks about our relationship with land and how we belong to land and land doesn't belong to us. Land is the residence of our more than human relatives, the dust of our ancestors, the holder of seeds, the maker of rain, or teacher. Land is not capital to which we have property rights, rather it is the place of which we have the moral responsibility and reciprocity for its gift of life. We all need to move from our anthropocentric worldviews toward a new paradigm that cares for the community of life on Earth, including our older brothers and sisters, animals and plants. Robin Wall Kimmerer also talks about colonialists and how they took away children, language, land, and almost everything from indigenous people. In the face of such loss, one thing our people could not surrender was the meaning of land. In the settler mind, the land was property, real estate, capital, or natural resources. But to our people, it was everything: identity, the connection to our ancestors, the home to our non-human family, plants and animals, or pharmacy or library, the source of all that sustain us. Our lands are where our responsibility to the world is enacted. Sacred ground, it belonged to itself. It was a gift, not a commodity, so it could never be bought or sold. In the Western tradition, there is a recognized hierarchy of beings, with, of course, the human being on top, the magic of evolution, the darling of creation, and animals and plants at the bottom. But in native ways of knowing, humans are often referred as the younger brothers and sisters of creation. This makes everything totally different. You respect your older brothers and sisters. You don't abuse them, you don't exploit them, you don't look at them as resources. Unfortunately, environmental education has failed to address animal rights advocacy as part of its agenda. We don't hear about animal rights in environmental education at all. In environmental education, animal rights have often been blended with more general ecological terms like sustainability, conservation, and biology. And environmental education have neglected to address the animal ethics adequately. We mainly focus on human problems, sustainability for humans, market economy, conservation, and natural resources. In the opposite of market economy, we have gift economy. In a gift economy, we tend to respond to nature as part of ourselves, not a stranger or alien available for exploitation, not a resource. We need to diversify our perspective to avoid falling into the trap of reducing environmental education to an instrument promoting particular version of sustainability practiced only for humans. The dominant sustainability paradigm condemns unethical practices related to gender, class, sexuality, and race, but rarely address ecological injustice or animal rights violation. Thank you.
I'm Susanna, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about how Eve Tuck's piece on suspending damage relates to decolonizing frameworks of research. Eve Tuck writes her suspending damage piece at the time close to the International Polar Year, which was 2007 to 2009, bringing over 200 research projects from over 60 nations to the Arctic and Antarctic, reporting from indigenous polar peoples and settler scientists on the severity of climate change. This was the first International Polar Year. There were 3 before this, in which indigenous peoples in polar regions were considered an integral part, the focus of inquiry, and Tuck mentions this as a mixed signal of progress. While it was a step towards redressing the omission of indigenous polar peoples as integral to polar places and holding deep, valid knowledge, valid in quotes as well too, valid according to whom, it also ushered settler scholars into indigenous communities still wary of scientists and scarred from the ancestral damage that extractive research has had on these communities. Legacies of eugenics, enforced sterilization, using cultural and human samples extracted from communities, paint a picture from the white lens of what indigeneity looks like, without informed consent or even a moral compass of understanding how this causes intergenerational damage and trauma. Tuck's desire-based research concept centers the voices of marginalized groups, bringing in themes of complexities, whole personhood, and all of our contradictory, wonderful workings. In order to center these voices, it is important that the researcher adopt decolonial frameworks to utilize and revisit often. The research that you may set out to do may not be what the community actually needs and is asking for. Develop relationships and be open to doing research that will benefit the community and not yourself. Be open to the fact that it might not be you who's right for the job for very specific research that's needed. Recognizing the validity of Indigenous epistemologies and the fact that the peoples living on these lands from time immemorial have lived here sustainably for generations is an important step in decentering whiteness, capitalism, and colonialism in research methods. Many scholars who do work in decolonizing frameworks, such as Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall with his concept of two-eyed seeing, Cree scholar Dwayne Donald's concept of ethical relationality. I'm going to talk a little bit about Renee Poloni-Louis' framework for Indigenous-based research. So this Indigenous methodology and with research agendas, these include 4 unwavering principles. The first of relational accountability, which means the dependence on everything and everyone around them. It's casually referred to as, all our relations, be it air, water, rocks, trees, animals, insects, humans, and so forth. The second being respectful representation. The third being reciprocal appropriation. The relationships you have with Indigenous communities need to be this reciprocal give and take. There's more to it than just going into a community, doing your research and extracting from it. There needs to be give as well too. And rights and regulation. With relational accountability, as researchers responsible for nurturing and maintaining relationships with specific community collaborators, but also entire communities and non-human networks of relations. This is really important. This principle of relational accountability emerged as an Indigenous response to extractive modes of research. Also, Louis argues that the research on Indigenous issues and research conducted with Indigenous nations should be carried out in a manner which is respectful and ethically sound from the perspective of the Indigenous peoples being worked with. While this may seem simple, it's easily overlooked, and much research with Indigenous peoples fails this basic test. As researchers, we are trained to conduct ourselves in what we determine to be ethical ways, but this training is most commonly based in the ethics of Western science and reduces Indigenous partners to human subjects or key informants of research instead of being somebody you're walking a path with. The complexities of the various Indigenous communities vary greatly. There's so much more to say beyond and explore beyond the confines of this presentation about the range of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit epistemologies. Exploring how Tech's desire-based framework can center these voices in a decolonizing research methodology gives voice to this diversity and complexity.